Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're excited to explore legal support for renters, our policy solution that guarantees a right to counsel for all eligible tenants facing eviction. But before we get into our great panel discussion today, I'd like to take a little bit to tell you about CityHealth and the work that we do in cities. So I'm Lauren Talley. I'm the Senior Program Assistant here at CityHealth, and I'm a member of a small team of government relations professionals, policy experts, and communication specialists who are working every day to make healthy choices available for residents in America's biggest cities. You'll also hear a little bit later from my CityHealth colleague, Akeem Anderson, who will be leading the panel discussion. Now, a little bit about us. CityHealth was founded at the De Beaumont Foundation with a mission to promote upstream health-related and equitable policy interventions in America's largest cities. And in 2018, Kaiser Permanente joined the De Beaumont Foundation as CityHealth's second national partner. And our goal here at CityHealth is to provide cities with tried and tested policy solutions that can increase access to healthy choices and also create opportunities for everyone to live full and healthy lives. CityHealth partners in the 75 largest cities across America to adopt healthy policies. And as you can see in this map, our 75 cities represent not only geographic diversity, but also political diversity, as well as they're in states that vary widely in respect to local authority and also preemption. And even if your city is not on this list, we provide all of our policy information, our research, best practices, and tools, all for free on our website at cityhealth.org. Now, we work in these 75 cities to adopt a package of 12 health promoting policy solutions, and this includes legal support for renters, which we'll dive into later. And these policies provide city leaders with a menu of choices that are centered on health equity and address health disparities in communities. Our solutions focus exclusively on upstream prevention-oriented interventions that are designed to address the social determinants of health by preventing health issues before they start. Now, we also can't do all of this alone. For every policy that we have in our package, CityHealth partners with a leading organization that provides technical assistance, subject matter expertise, as well as assessment support. And if you represent a city in our footprint, we're happy to connect you with any of these partners to answer questions and provide free technical support to help build strong policies in your community. Now, today, we're going to dive a bit deeper into legal support for renters. This is what we call our policy solution that guarantees a right to counsel. We're excited to be joined today by our partner, the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel, as well as two leading advocates in San Francisco and St. Louis to talk about their experiences with this policy in their communities. And I do want to make a quick housekeeping note. If you have a question, feel free to submit at any time at the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar, and we'll be happy to answer any of your questions. And finally, every year, CityHealth assesses the 75 cities on all 12 of our policies, including legal support for renters. We look to see how many of these policies the city has in place, as well as the strength of those policies when compared to our criteria. Cities can earn a gold, a silver, or a bronze medal based on the number of policies as well as the quality of those policies. And you can find a complete city-by-city assessment on our website. And with that, I will turn it over to John Pollock, who is the coordinator at the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Can you have the next slide, please? So here today, again, we're here to talk about right to counsel and legal support for renters, which is CityHealth's term for right to counsel. Next slide, please. I just wanted to mention that the NCCRC, which I represent today, has about 600 participants and partners across 45 states. A lot of different kinds of stakeholders are in the coalition. We're a very state and locally driven movement. We don't have kind of a top-down approach. We we work with jurisdictions to implement and enact what they are seeking to do and help them the best way we can. We take a variety of different approaches and work in a lot of areas, but for today's conversation is our work around eviction, right to counsel. Next slide, please. So just to really level set for a moment what a right to counsel actually is, you may actually even see a lot of discussion in the press where it'll say some jurisdiction has a right to counsel when in fact they haven't really taken the step that's necessary to be a right to counsel yet. The first step that actually is essential is that there's a government commitment established in the law. There has to be an ordinance or a statute. It has to say something like such and such people, whoever they are entitled to counsel, have a right to counsel, shall be provided counsel, something along those lines. It has to be funded through public funding. This is not something that you do with charitable donations or asking attorneys to volunteer. It has to be done ultimately by the government, passed as law and funded by the government. It's for full representation, meaning that the attorney represents the tenant, that they actually have an attorney-client relationship, that they negotiate on behalf of the tenant, they go to court if they have to. It's basically what it isn't is a situation where they just meet the tenant, tell them here's what you should do, and then send them off to kind of do it on their own. That's more like what we call brief advice or guidance. The right to counsel is centered around actual full representation. And while evictions are at the center of what we'll be talking about today, some of the laws that have been passed actually cover things like termination of a person's housing voucher, because if they lose the voucher that pays for their housing, that will eventually lead to an eviction because they won't be able to afford the housing. So that's often included too. Next slide, please. These are the criteria that CityHealth uses to grade the cities on right to counsel. And you can basically see there are 3 levels: bronze, silver, and gold. And in a gold environment, the city basically provides counsel for all tenants. There are no eligibility requirements. That basically they provide a right to counsel for evictions and at least one other sort of extended proceeding, like it could be a subsidy termination, it could be appeals, it could be that they've broadened it a little bit further, and that they also have an evaluation of the program and a public reporting requirement. And depending on what the city does, they get these different medals. Next slide, please. And where we are at this point is we went from 0 jurisdictions having a right to counsel in 2016 and before to 23 now with basically 5 states and 1 county and 17 cities. And including, as you can see, there's been a lot of growth in the last from 2021 to the present day. And there's also a lot of diversity in where these right to counsels are passing. That you have the New Yorks and San Franciscos, of course, but you also have Louisville, Kentucky, and Toledo, Kansas City. So just a lot of diversity geographically, city size, and other factors like that. So it's really quite a spread of jurisdictions. Next slide, please. This is just a list of some of the states that have legislation, had or have legislation pending this year. Again, you can see that there's a really interesting mix of states, both kind of in the North and the South and the Midwest, and just showing that the kind of continuing growth of interest in this policy. Next slide, please. And this is also intended to just give you an idea of places where we're working that have campaigns on the ground. Some of them have ordinances that have been introduced already. They're not yet at the enactment stage, but a really diverse list of places that are contemplating right to counsel. Places that might be a surprise to some people, but some really major markets like Los Angeles and Phoenix, which have some of the most evictions in the country, and then smaller cities and in different kinds of locations. So again, just to show, if you're looking at the political will, right now there's a lot of it because there's so much momentum from so many different places. It helps convince other cities and states, if South Carolina is looking at it, we can too. Or if Louisville, Kentucky passed it, we can too, because they're a southern city, we're a southern city. So it helps looking at where this action is happening, which we have all on our website. We have all the enacted jurisdictions on our website at civilrighttocounsel.org. And if you're curious where activity is happening, which we don't necessarily share publicly, please reach out and contact us, and we'll be happy to tell you if it's happening in your community. Next slide, please. One of the things we wanted to talk about today is, one of the questions we get is, well, how can we get there? do we need to do like a pilot? Like, do we need to start off with just providing some representation and then building the case to get to full, to getting to an actual right to counsel? A pilot generally is a program where a government or a private funder will give funding to legal aid to provide more representation for a period of time. It doesn't promise that anyone will get representation. It's not a right. It's usually time limited. And these were some places that had such pilots and actually then used the information they got from the pilot program to help build the case for an actual right to counsel. So you can see here on this slide, New York, San Francisco, Philly, Seattle, and Hennepin County, Minnesota all did pilots that preceded the enactment of right to counsel, in some cases by a year, in some cases by, in some cases, 6 years, but basically helped build the evidence base by collecting information on how it improved outcomes, whether it saved money, what the delivery system looked like, and really creating the infrastructure for a right to counsel to pass. Because once you have a pilot and the legal aid program starts to expand its services, the courts get more familiar with the idea of attorneys coming in, the government has started to take a stake in investing in tenant rep. Once all that happens and you get these great reports back, you can see here the report highlights from some of these pilots were, tremendous cost savings, significant reduction in disruptive displacement of tenants, higher rates of staying in their homes, just like a really, really, really positive, different kinds of outcomes. And that really helped build the momentum, the political will for then pushing for an ordinance or a bill or a statute at the state level. Next slide, please. So just to give a couple of examples of data from places that did then pass the right to counsel, you're going to hear from Aura today about San Francisco. In the initial years of passage of the right to counsel, they had the filing rate decreased at first. They had an almost 60% unit retention rate for tenants. In New York City, it was 84%. The filings went down. The defaults went down. This is tenants that just don't answer the complaint and just don't even engage in the eviction process at all. That went down by a third after right to counsel passed. So, what we're seeing is that it's delivering the results we thought it was going to deliver. It's not just a theory. Next slide, please. And these are more examples from other cities. Again, Boulder, Kansas City, and Cleveland, avoiding eviction, getting additional time to move, getting rental assistance, just really having a variety of different results, whether tenants stay in their home or not. All tenants were getting, basically some benefit from representation. And where tenants get additional time to move, where they get an eviction record that's clear, where they get a reduction of the amount of rent that they're supposed to owe, those things all help them go forward and find more housing, new housing. Whereas if you start off with, looking for a rental with an eviction record and a huge rent debt that hurts your credit and no time to move, the chances that you're going to become homeless are significantly greater. And we're seeing that happening with these programs. Next slide, please. We also find that, CityHealth's medals, the cities do care a lot about these medals and the rankings that they get, and, not just whether they get a medal, but what level that medal is. There are 75 cities in CityHealth's cohort. We work with a great number of them. So again, it's, talk to us, talk to CityHealth. If your city is not yet holding a medal and you want to pursue this, we can support you. CityHealth can support you in getting your city to get excited about this idea and pursuing this particular policy. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to mention in my last minute is we often get a question about how these right to counsel programs are funded. And the good news is that there are a lot of different ways that it's done. You can see here, GR stands for general revenue, and some of the programs have just purely, the cities have allocated, just general revenue. In some places, they're looking at a mix. They have some private funding in the mix initially. That's often to help as they're scaling up the program. Ultimately, they'll get to, just having, hopefully government funding and not relying on any private funding, but it helps sometimes in the early stages. Some have used temporary federal funding and then have transitioned to other sources of revenue. And then some have actually created new sources of revenue that their laws allow them to create, where they've used that new revenue to fund a right to counsel. So there are just a lot of ways to do this, and we're happy to help talk through what cities have done and what your city could do if you're not sure where to draw revenue for a program like this to make it feasible. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Akeem Anderson, who's going to lead our panel discussion.
Thank you, John. My name is Akeem Anderson. I am the Government Affairs Director for CityHealth, and I work with the 75 largest cities, mostly with mayors and city council members, as they determine which policies in our policy package they'd like to work on. But I also help coordinate some of the efforts that our partners, like John, does in coordination with our city partners. We are joined by Aura and Lee of San Francisco and St. Louis. What I'll do is ask the first question of Aura and then let you tell a bit about yourself and the work that you do, and then we'll do the same for Lee. The title of this webinar says From Concept to Pilot to Game Changer. Aura, starting with you, can you talk a bit about how San Francisco followed that path when it comes to your right to counsel and the role you played in that process?
Sure. So my name is Aura Prachovnik. I serve as the Director of Litigation and Policy with the San Francisco Eviction Defense Collaborative. And the EDC is the lead agency in San Francisco's Tenant Right to Counsel program. So our there's different models one could follow in terms of how a right to counsel could be run. You could have sort of a public defender model where a government agency runs the program, or have it be a city funding of a nonprofit, but one-stop shopping. What San Francisco chose to do was to harness the already existing advocacy movement that was fairly robust and already in place for assisting tenants challenged by evictions and other housing matters. And so we have our agency, the lead agency, which does a central intake, and 8 other agencies that participate along with us, each of which serves a specific demographic niche. So for instance, Legal Assistance for the Elderly works with senior citizens. AIDS Legal Referral Panel works with people who are HIV positive, and so on down the list. Some work in particular neighborhoods, some with particular demographic groups. We have our Legal Services Corporation, which works with very low-income folks. And at the EDC, we're basically the agency of last resort. If it doesn't meet another place's demographic niche, we'll represent them, and we'll also represent the tenant if the other folks don't have the capacity to be taking a case. So we do that central screening and referral out to different participating agencies. Sort of to talk about that curve that you asked about, the voters of San Francisco passed our right to counsel through a voter initiative, Proposition F, which passed in 2018. And the city got behind it. It was one of the things voters like to do. It was an unfunded mandate, but it was initially funded by the city to go into effect in July of 2019. And because we harnessed this pre-existing robust tenant representation network, we were up and running immediately, starting in July of 2019. And slowly we're able to grow. I had a very strong initial 6 months. The data that John shared with you at the beginning came from those first 6 months, and then we were in COVID. And for the next 4 years, we had the moratoriums and the shutdowns of COVID. We've just looked back at our most recent fiscal year, which was really the clearest data post-COVID. So our 23-24 fiscal year shows even stronger numbers than those that John shared. So we have had a 92% favorable result in our full scope representation of tenants in our right to counsel program. We define favorable as either the tenant was able to retain their current housing, or through the settlement or litigation process, we were able to get them enough time and money to relocate to replacement housing. So that's an amazing result that we're very proud of, and really speaks to the importance of a tenant right to counsel program in order to address a crucial human necessity of shelter, which is otherwise disrupted through the eviction process. And it's somewhat I know we'll be getting into funding later, but it's something of a no-brainer for the cities to expend the kind of money that it takes to keep tenants housed. One of the best tools for homelessness avoidance is, if somebody's already got a home, is to keep them in it. So in terms of our current model, just to summarize, we have the structure of 8 participating legal services organizations. We have a full eligibility. So anybody who is a resident in San Francisco and receives a notice of termination or court papers for unlawful detainer, they are eligible for full scope representation in our with no financial screen whatsoever. We are fairly unique in that regard, and I could speak further about that if people are interested. I will just briefly mention that we are not completely successful at meeting the vision of Proposition F, which mandates full scope representation for all tenants. Like many agencies around the country, we do struggle with capacity, with recruitment and hiring. And one of the ways we've chosen to address that is, although there's full eligibility for all tenants, we've created a prioritization system using what we refer to as a vulnerability score. And those with a higher score, using criteria that you would expect, elderly, minor children, language barriers, long-term housing, subsidized housing, those types of factors will up somebody's vulnerability. The higher the score, the more certain that they'll get full scope representation. Those with a lower score will receive self-help assistance through the initial pleading stage, and then we'll give them limited scope of representation at the mandatory settlement conference that comes up in our process. Right now, we're at about 85% of our clients receive the full scope representation. That's not where we want to be at, but it's certainly a positive step forward in the process.
Thank you for that. Lee, similarly, St. Louis didn't start with a pilot, so I'm very curious how you guys got this issue on the council's radar. Also, I know you guys are in the process of implementation now, and we'll come to that in a second, especially being one of the newer cities that has passed a law around that. Can you talk about what spurred this in St. Louis as opposed to starting with a pilot program?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Lee Camp. I am the managing attorney for housing and civil advocacy at Arch City Defenders. We are a nonprofit holistic legal advocacy organization in St. Louis, Missouri. A little history, we have historically always been in the homelessness space. We are civil rights lawyers, first and foremost. I am a tenants lawyer first and foremost. As you can see, I was in court this morning. We were always in the homelessness space. We have continued to build our housing practice here. And really the critical point for us that I would say raised the volume from, an aspiration to pass a right-to-counsel program or looking at our neighbors not far away in Kansas City or Louisville who had these programs. It was the pandemic for us. That really was the moment that there was political will here. There was change amongst our political administrations, our Board of Aldermen, which is the city council in the city of St. Louis. We had political will matching up with a moment that everyone knew someone enduring housing instability at that time. And we seized on that opportunity as advocates that knew this problem would exist, was existing pre-pandemic, certainly still exists today. We use that as kind of our jumping off point to really bring this in a more fleshed out, true proposal that could go into law at that point. Of course, I did not do that on my own. I certainly don't think attorneys need to be the ones that, I think we have specific tools and insight that we can provide to what the eviction process looks like day to day, some of the difficulties of navigating it without an attorney, et cetera. But this was really driven by community in St. Louis who, initially when we introduced the first piece of legislation here in the city of St. Louis was in January of 2023. That wasn't successful, but by July, in a separate legislative session of last year, we were able to pass this law, which is great. And it speaks to the determination of the community to see this done, our organizing partners. We had John coming in to testify before our city council. We brought everyone we could think of to the table to explain why we needed this now, relied heavily, again, on those jurisdictions close to us. As John had mentioned, I'd helped with the Kansas City right-to-counsel ordinance in a kind of ancillary role myself. So that helped me have a little bit of footing for the political game that was ahead. But certainly, we aren't Kansas City. We aren't Louisville. We're not San Francisco. We've seen the results. We needed to craft a program that worked for St. Louis and the community that lives here, a city that is 60% renter, 40% homeowner, look different. And we wanted to design a program that really looked different, and happy to get into the specifics of those with any follow-up.
Yeah, let's go ahead and dive into that. You guys are supposed to be implementing the law earlier this month, I believe, but there have been some hiccups in the process. Can you walk us through some of the lessons learned when it comes to implementation?
Yeah, absolutely. I was jotting down a short list that just kept growing today of the lessons learned in under a year. I think absolutely we assumed that we would need to be nimble throughout this process, and nothing has proved truer. We did not, St. Louis doesn't have the same types of nonprofit infrastructure, organizations like ours that San Francisco has. So we were relying on our office, a legal aid office, and a fair housing organization that was operating at the time in St. Louis, really for input and advice around what this looked like on the front end, and then the implementation part. I think the first big hurdle for us, and this we'll take a moment to explain the way we crafted the law. We set up a system where within 60 days of the law being passed, the city of St. Louis was to post a job posting for a position called the right-to-counsel coordinator, who would actually work within City Hall in our Department of Human Services. We had just had a change in the Department of Human Services director position too. That certainly could have played into some things, but that position didn't get posted within 60 days. So the very first deadline in this wasn't met. I don't think that was nefarious or intentional by any means, but the way that jobs get posted in the city of St. Louis is through a pretty bureaucratic process of going through a personnel department that then rates a position for what its salary scale would be. Then there's back and forth between the department who's trying to hire about whether that's correct or not. That process, believe it or not, the job is posted. People have been interviewed as of today. It took until last month in June from a law that was passed and signed into law last July to just get the initial coordinator position posted. And that was a really key piece, because embracing that nimble nature of what you would need in a right-to-counsel program for the first time, we did not employ a pilot. We were going to employ a right-to-counsel program that graded in over time, and I can explain that as well. But we had designed this program such that there were laws around this, but the administration was supposed to be designed by the coordinator themselves. And in conjunction, we had hoped would be in conjunction with the advocates that were doing this work, those within the courts, to actually fully flesh out the process. That was supposed to be done within 120 days. So we would have been ready for about a 6-month gear up if these deadlines would have initially been met. We have no coordinator, so we technically don't have that administrative plan that we were looking for. That will be something that is written into law that we're certainly watching right now and expect to start day one for a coordinator. That being said, that certainly hiccups there. Another hiccup we encountered, the Fair Housing Organization, they did eviction defense as a part of their work, but not the core of their work. Actually had some funding issues, and they're no longer operating here. So we saw the loss of a service provider that could potentially provide these services and put lawyers in the courtrooms with tenants as they're going through the eviction process. And then generally a much more pragmatic one. I think the volume lowered around this, or maybe the foot was let off the gas, and that we were excited to see the program signed into law. It was certainly exciting for lots of us that have worked on this issue for years. But I don't know that we were as diligent as we should have been with the follow-up and the pressure to meet those deadlines. Of course, yet another bureaucratic kind of barrier there as a potential vendor. they deemed that there could be a conflict of interest if we were to inform an RFP process, those type things, the funding contract processes. And so we weren't that involved as the city tried to figure this out for a moment. And I think there's an argument that there's a conflict of interest potentially. I also think that you need the advocates that are close to this issue and the people enduring these issues to be front and center in the conversation as you try to roll these programs out. I'm not sure that we did a great job as a city on that, although I meet with the Department of Human Service director every week. I've not lost optimism because we've hit the hiccups, but it certainly has been a setback. And we were technically supposed to employ the first round of legal services should have began in July, on July 1st, and no services have begun yet.
Yeah. Do you think that a combination of normal government bureaucracy, especially when it comes to creating the job description, and having sat on that side before, I totally empathize with that piece. But that combined with maybe a lack of anticipating that timeline, or overambitious timeline, created some of these problems?
Yeah, I think so. And, I'm sure we'll talk about the stakeholders that were involved specifically. But I think we were a little caught off guard because we had made a recalibration, we being the advocates generally, had made a recalibration from January when we initially introduced our first right to counsel proposal in the city. We have a unique funding or budgeting system here in the city of St. Louis. It's led by the mayor, the head of the city council, the board of aldermen, president, and a comptroller. And we did not have commitments. We had commitments from the legislative branch, but not the other side to fund this. Initially, there was political appetite, talking points out there, sure, that they supported these things, but money is obviously a very real thing here. And we didn't approach that office when we felt resistance, the mayor's office, when we felt resistance, and it ended up not being the right call. We, again, had the legislative support and we kept it throughout. This thing passed with 1 no vote on our city council. But when we came back to the table, I worked directly with legislators and then worked with the mayor's staff, her senior staff, to ensure that we were writing something that we thought we could put into place. I'm not even sure the mayor's office anticipated some of the kind of bureaucratic hurdles that we had to jump through. And, maybe we were a little ambitious with the time. But again, we were coming out of a major housing crisis. Rental assistance, if anyone is on here and still has it, they're lucky. That's certainly dwindling down. We saw the moment and needed to meet that need. So we were being nimble, stepping away from other work to meet the need in that moment. And I don't think any of us necessarily anticipated this, which is, again, why I'm still optimistic. We'll get it pounded out and figured out.
No, thank you. Thank you for those reflections. Or Lee brought up something that I hear often from cities who are interested in this policy. And that is the issue around finding enough attorneys to do this work. And it's not just in this industry. Like, many industries are facing challenges when it comes to staffing. Public service law is not immune to that. Can you talk about some of the ways that you guys are addressing this, but give insight to what other cities who aren't as blessed as San Francisco when it comes to many advocates who are willing to do this work? What are some of the things that they can look at?
It's definitely something that we struggle with, and I think that's true of every legal service organization across the country, whether they are seeking to implement a right to counsel program or otherwise, is issues related to staffing, and that includes the initial recruitment and the retention of staff, and particularly the challenges at the higher level. So we've learned that we could hire fresh out of law school, recent graduates, but somebody who is more sort of the supervising attorney, managing attorney level has become more and more difficult. And it was particularly a challenge in 2019 when we were up and running. As I said, we were harnessing the already existing structure of 8 or 9 legal service organizations, and we were all basically just competing with each other to hire the ever-shrinking staff of available people who could do this work and poaching each other's attorneys, and that was clearly not viable. So one of the things we learned is that we have to work together and not poach one another's staff. What I think that we've come upon is a process that's worked very effectively for us, and that is creating a true pipeline. As I mentioned, we were able to hire brand new attorneys much more easily than we can hire somebody with 10 years of experience. The litigator in eviction defense, just with vast experience, is not really out there chopping at the bit to come to our offices. So we get the students as law clerks to come in during their 2L year, and then they like the work and they stick with us, and we've created a fellowship program. And our fellowship starts on September 1st, and that tracks the timing scheduling of the bar here in California, which is similar in many states. So the law schools finish up in May, the students study, and then they take the bar the last week in July. We give them a little bit of breather for the month of August, and we have them start with us September 1st. So this year we have a cohort of 5 new law fellows that will be starting with us on September 1st. We're very excited about that. That's just at EDC. But some of our colleagues at our companion right-to-counsel agencies are also bringing in a cohort of new law fellows. And our fellowship lasts just a 10-month period. So it goes from September through June. And at the end of that period, we hope to hire on some of those law fellows as staff attorneys. And that's either because of growth within our agency, increased funding, or the inevitable attrition when staff leave. So our intent is to retain about 2 or 3 of our 5 law fellows each year, and the rest we're going to pepper the world with the housing justice warriors of tomorrow. So we share them with the other local agencies and the ones around the state. And when you all get your right to counsel programs up and running, our law fellows will be eager to come to you and start working. We have graduates of our fellowship program sprinkled around the country already. We've also created something that we call UD School. So rather than reinventing the wheel and having each agency duplicate each other's efforts, we pool our resources, and starting in September, when we all bring in this fresh cohort, we begin this program of intensive training for all of the new staff. So either the new law fellows or new attorneys that are starting up in September. We have a 3-day intensive school where across all 8 of the legal services agencies that are participating in Right to Counsel all send their new staff. It means that we share the skills and resources of the more experienced supervising attorneys from our different agencies, and we don't have to duplicate each other's efforts. This will be our 3rd year, this coming September, running our UD school. So we've had 2 successive runs that we're building on and learning from. After the first week in September, where we do that intensive, we have some follow-up 1-day sessions. There'll be one in November, one in March, and then one in May. And then our graduates who stick around as staff attorneys, we send them to the NEDA trial advocacy training that a number of agencies use. But because we have such a large group, we've developed a relationship with NEDA, and we do a very specific trial preparation training geared towards right to counsel. And we feel that this has been very effective in finally being able to grow our staff and get closer to that vision, as I said, of giving full scope representation to everybody rather than this combination of limited plus full scope. So we're quite excited about the combined approach of a pipeline linked with the UD school. One final new measure that we've had the luxury of having enough funding to do is we're also giving fellowships too. So actually a stipend that our fellows receive, it's a recruitment tool. It entices them to come to EDC versus some of their other options. It's intended to be used for bar studies. So we're giving them a bar stipend. We want them to take off 3 months and not do anything but study for the bar so that they have a really good shot at doing it the first time. But California has a very rigorous and difficult bar exam. It's one of the lower bar pass rates around the country. So we want our candidates to be able to give it their all and really devote some time. And we help them with this money, which can pay for bar review course. It can pay for a time off from work while they truly study. And the commitment that they make to us is that they have to stay with us for the full fellowship. And if offered a staff position, they have to stay for a full 2 years. So
Yeah.
if they don't, then they have to refund to us the stipend that we gave them.
No. Lee, anything you want to add to that of how you guys are looking at it in St. Louis?
No, certainly anticipating that problem. Those are all fantastic ideas, particularly the fellowship. I could speak firsthand to this. I started as a legal aid housing attorney 10 years ago. I'm young in my practice, and she's right. Not many people make it even 10 years in this career at times. But it's about messaging to a degree too. Right now, the public defender model has been mentioned a couple times today. There are people that don't want to be public defenders for a variety of reasons. They want to do civil litigation versus criminal, but they do want to get in courtrooms, and they're eager. And it is about getting out and recruiting and finding those people and letting them know the opportunities you're going to get to develop core skills as a lawyer at a very early stage in your career, particularly if you want to litigate. Certainly, I prefer to work with people that are very committed to this work. And I know that there are a lot of those. I see it in our intern cohort at our office right now. But that being said, there are people that want to just learn how to be a courtroom litigator. As that becomes fewer and far between to find those opportunities into a courtroom, this is a great opportunity to handle cases from the very start to the end, sometimes in a fast way that forces you to really strengthen all the tools that you have as an attorney on the spot. Those are skills that I use the same strategies I use as a brand new attorney defending an eviction case that I do when I file a class action lawsuit. It's all the same. And I think getting that message out is really important, and working with local law schools. St. Louis has 2 law schools here, no landlord tenant clinic. That absolutely should change to build that pipeline as we roll this program out.
We're going to bring John back in a second, but before we do, I do want to ask you guys about equity and how equity is built into the policies in St. Louis and San Francisco. In our 2.0 package, CityHealth has really put equity at the forefront, and equity is one of the criteria that cities must consider in order to achieve a medal. In some instances, it's a goal. In order to achieve a gold, you have to have equity in it. Or even to have a silver or bronze, you have to have equity into it. As you guys were thinking about your policy, or you mentioned the criteria, the vulnerability score that you guys have, as advocates in St. Louis, for you, Lee, were thinking about this policy, how did you think about how the role that equity would play into it?
Yeah, it was very difficult to write that piece into law. I will say we struggled a little bit trying to get crafty with that. That has always been at the forefront of this conversation. Our organization was part of a cohort of others that released a report in 2018 about segregation in St. Louis, and a specific recommendation was a right-to-counsel program as a way to attack what we were seeing in our segregation patterns across the region. The way that we actually institutionalized some sort of, I guess, an equity indicator or scope around this, we didn't use a traditional pilot program, but our program is set up in a way that it phases in over 4 years. This year, the goal was to serve 25% of eviction filings. A goal, aspirational maybe, but that was something that didn't need a lot of staffing up on the front end. And how did we pick the 25%? We went to the neighborhoods that had the highest number of eviction filings. Well, those neighborhoods track every, segregation indicator you can look at, race indicator, gender indicator, class indications. Those were inherently built in because we had done research on the front end. We had done scholarship on this years back. We knew if we went to the neighborhoods where this was happening and then phased it into 50% of the filings, which brought in a few more zip codes. We pegged it down to zip codes. As we grew the program, we would certainly be getting to those that had the highest needs based on their geographic location, which in St. Louis tells you a lot about an individual. Unfortunately, right? It does. So we chose to go that route. I still think that will be a positive down the road, but it's certainly, you know, we're waiting to see the results. We will be gathering data on the back end though to see who's being served. That's another duty of our coordinator. Service providers provide the data. They are to prepare a public facing report that goes to their boss, the director of human services, and the community. So this program is pretty transparent too. And if there appear to be issues, I would hope that the community is there to call them out as well. And, you know, we did not do this without Black organizing at all. This was heavily led by a campaign called We the Tenants that is anchored by us and a Black organizing organization that was at the forefront of what Black renters wanted at that time as well.
Yeah. Or I see you're typing your answer to one of the questions that kind of builds off this in the chat. If you want to go ahead and just answer that live, the question from Amy Hall builds off the prior question around the vulnerability score and what does EDC then do with the vulnerability score? If you want to go ahead and answer that live.
Sure, I'll answer that live, but I'll also link it to other ways that I feel that our tenant right to counsel program addresses equity. I would just say it as a starter that housing justice work is racial justice work, particularly in an environment like San Francisco where there is such a lack of affordable housing, and the most marginalized members of the population are, you know, one eviction away from living on the streets, basically. And it's crucial that if we want to retain the diversity of our city, be that keeping seniors, artists, students, and a racially diverse population, we need to have eviction defense work so that people can remain housed. And also linked with that, we're very careful, you know, to go back to our earlier question about the pipeline we're trying to create, is we also need to pay attention to diversity in our hiring policies so that the clients that we serve can see themselves mirrored in the attorneys and social workers and paralegals who that they are working with. Linking back to our vulnerability score, because that's certainly a way that we try to bring equity into our work. If we have tight capacity within the system, because of how quickly eviction cases move, it doesn't work to have a wait list. So if somebody is not able to receive full scope representation right in the door, we can't, you know, say we'll get to you next week. So that's why implementing a vulnerability score felt very important, so that we didn't, I don't want to use the word waste, but we didn't expend our capacity on somebody who really didn't need it as much, that they had the sophistication to make it through on their own, and then have somebody else who maybe is struggling with language barriers not get the full scope representation. So I shared earlier in the Q&A the actual scoring that we use, and I can answer questions about, but why is there such a large number for being elderly? It has to do with some funding that one of our agencies has, basically. But basically, we were trying to incorporate all of the criteria that would be important, with a negative number for somebody whose income is a high multiple of poverty. And depending on the capacity in the system, we create a cutoff that be adjusted up or down. When we first implemented this scoring right after the COVID moratorium was lifted, our cutoff was 30. We've since dropped it to 20, and I am hoping with our next round of hires and more attorneys taking more cases, we'll cut it down to 10. So right now, if with a 20 vulnerability score cutoff, only those clients whose score is 20 or higher will receive a referral to full scope representation. Anybody with a lower score will receive a self-help assistance. We'll file a proper answer with them. We'll guide them through the process. And then when they're at their settlement conference, they'll be given a limited scope attorney to do that with them. And as I mentioned earlier, the breakdown right now is about 84% are getting the full scope. Those with the 20 or lower vulnerability score are getting only the limited scope assistance. And I monitor it regularly, looking at capacity in the system, and raise or lower that cutoff as needed.
John, welcome back. Do you want to add to some of the equity conversation?
Yeah, sure. And I just posted in the chat that we worked really hard on what we called like a playbook, basically on race equity in, excuse me, in efforts to get right to counsel enacted and effectively implemented. One of the things that's been hard is that some of the campaigns have shied away from equity as a central theme because of the way it's received by certain policymakers view it negatively. And our belief and our core mission is that that has to be tackled head on. You can't run a campaign. You can't talk about right to counsel in evictions and not talk about equity. It's just too connected. When you look at who's going through eviction, the impacts it's having on BIPOC communities, it has to be made a central point. So the playbook was our way of working with an expert in the field who said, you know, if this is challenging for you in your community, here are some ways you can try to approach it that may be better received, sort of ramping up like the messaging, starting at the lowest level and kind of building. So we really do want people to do that. And it's again, it's not just about what's said. The way the right to counsel is implemented has to be equitable too. Like it has to be, if the right to counsel isn't going to reach everyone at once, it has to be rolled out in a way that is going to be, you know, consider principles of equity and who goes first. And that also requires a lot of community input and not, you know, decision makers making that decision without consulting the affected communities. So, we really view equity as really part and parcel with all of this work.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I know Aura and John and Lee and some other members of the CityHealth team have been answering some questions. But if you have questions, now is the time to go ahead and drop them in the chat so we can get to them. I did see one question there that sparked my interest around the Dillon rule, and I constantly hear from cities around the idea of preemption, especially in the climate where there is this state versus city fight that's happening. John, do you want to talk about how you guys approach the idea of preemption? And I'm really curious, Lee, from your perspective, how you guys navigated the threat of preemption.
So one thing it's important to distinguish is that Dillon's rule and preemption are actually separate problems. Dillon's rule has to do with, does the city have the power to pass? Was it given the power to sort of pass certain kinds of laws? And then preemption is, even if they were, has the state moving to take away that power, which is a different problem. We've seen, fortunately, there aren't a ton of Dillon's rule states, but the places where that's true, where they are Dillon's rule state, the question is, has the city been given a power that would explicitly allow them to pass a right to counsel ordinance? And the answer is, it's possible they have. That, you know, there are certain generalized powers the cities are given, and that an ordinance around tenant rep might fit in one of those generalized powers. So it has been explored in some places and, you know, seriously advanced even in the Dillon's rule context. And we are happy to talk to people about that. The preemption one is tougher, you know, but even there, the good news is that we haven't seen right to counsel be targeted for preemption yet. It has not ever been the subject of a preemption law. There have been many, many, many states that have preempted rent control and registries and just cause ordinances and all sorts of other things, but they haven't viewed right to counsel yet as sort of in the same bucket. And I think that has to do with the fact that, again, the real estate community is heavily represented in these proceedings, and it's hard to argue that tenants should be forbidden from having lawyers when they have them themselves. So we haven't seen that politically happen. And in fact, the polling data suggests right now that there's really broad support for right to counsel. And so we're not super seeing like a big wave of preemption against right to counsel. On the other hand, there have been some states that have just said everything in the landlord-tenant context is preempted, like the entire sphere. And in fact, Texas and Florida attempted that. Texas's law was actually enjoined by a court. But even those situations, there may be ways in which right to counsel is not preempted. And we're happy to explore those with advocates in those states to talk. And we have talked with advocates in both Texas and Florida about how a right to counsel law may still be viable even in that environment. It's not worth getting into all the details on this call, but if anyone is in a jurisdiction where they're worried about preemption or Dillon's rule, I really urge you to reach out and talk to us. We can help talk through what we've seen, how the law departments in other states have dealt with this question, and how it can be thought about, you know, still being viable even with these kinds of restrictions.
Lee, do you want to quickly add something?
Sure. Yeah, I'm certainly concerned with preemption challenges. In Missouri, you know, we're in a blue dot in a red state right now. No denying that. In Kansas City being the same, well, we both now have right to counsel ordinances. the two largest cities in the state. And we recently saw an attempt to preempt another tenant protection known as source of income discrimination protections to prevent individuals from being discriminated against, essentially for having housing choice vouchers that pays a portion of their rent. So we are seeing this start to play out in legislative proposals from the General Assembly, the state legislature. I think John's right. It doesn't necessarily pass a kind of common sense test that you aren't entitled to an attorney, but we can afford one so that we get one. I think there's a lot of messaging that can be used there. We actually went to the realtors and they were supportive of our right to counsel bill, and we brought landlords to testify. I thought litigation made weird bedfellows, and then I have landlords that I'm courting to testify at these open hearings. It was interesting and not necessarily a bad thing to, find that common ground at places. The other thing, there was a commitment here locally and kind of has been throughout the state of essentially reparations, that the realtors want to do some reparative work for past policy damage that has occurred. I think we're in a moment that they're more open to this idea than they're not. That being said, the state of Missouri has banned eviction moratoriums as of this legislative session ever in this state, unless I guess federalism comes into play. So it's certainly something, we're prepared to encounter. And if we do, we'll roll our sleeves up and get to work on those challenges.
One final question, and we cover the 75 largest cities. 16 of them have a medal in this policy. The other 59 are interested in this policy, and they always ask me about one thing: how do we pay for it? Especially with COVID funding, some of the COVID funding drying up. If you guys quickly want to talk about the funding piece in your areas, and John, if you want to tie a bow on it, on the importance of funding, but also how funding shouldn't be an issue when it is important, but it shouldn't be the deciding factor as to whether or not a city implements this policy. And we'll start with Aura.
So speaking briefly on the funding issue, our funding comes from general revenue sources. We are in the city's budget. Unfortunately, Prop F, as I said, was an unfunded mandate, and we go through the annual budget process. We just survived it for this year. I would love to have us more engrossed as a permanent, say, 5-year contract. It would make hiring and budgeting much easier. San Francisco does have some sort of homelessness prevention funds that could be utilized. We have what was called Prop C, which was an additional tax on individuals and businesses that earn more than $50 million a year in gross receipts. That goes to funding homelessness prevention, and we are able to access some of that for our funding. Unfortunately, that's down after the post-COVID period, but it's coming back up again. And we also have Proposition I, which was an increased transfer tax on properties that were over $10 million. So part of the astronomical housing market means that there's also some money out there that can be harnessed for our right to counsel work. But it's also, given I just came out of a budget battle, it's really a no-brainer when you get down to it. Our cost per case is $6,300 on average. That's what we're budgeted for. And our 92% favorable success rate that I already shared means that 2% of our clients are avoiding homelessness. So the city is paying about $6,300 to keep somebody housed when they otherwise would be paying $50,000 to $70,000 to shelter a homeless person. It's like just good economic decision making, and the city should not be struggling with that kind of a decision.
Lee, you want to quickly add?
Yeah, we obviously are just now getting going. Anticipate this. We funded ours initially with ARPA funding. St. Louis was kind of hit the luck of the lottery and got a large ARPA funding grant there. We're funding it there now. It is written into our law that it has to be funded in some source. So there's a legal requirement that this program be funded. And I think John suggested this earlier in his slides. There are ways to do it. We've just started regulating Airbnbs for the first time in the city of St. Louis. That money, we want it for tenants, certainly. We'd love to see some of the public safety money come to tenants. This is a public safety issue, a public health issue. We'd like to see those funding sources also lent over to us. I think private funding's on the table for us as well as we launch this. And then, you know, when we actually get this program rolling and see the decrease in homelessness that it will truly lead to, as we've seen by the data, that's going to reduce costs and those funds can be reallocated. So I think it's a no-brainer to fund this.
Yep. John, anything else you want to add?
Just to say that the fact that most of the focus in of the discussions now are around funding and not is this a good idea shows how far the movement has gone. There's generally a consensus now that tenants should have lawyers, that there should be a right, and the focus on the funding is what we have to solve it. It really does show a big shift. That's one. And the only other point is, you know, that there absolutely should not, you know, we don't want to see laws passed without the funding sorted out, but that it is, their cities are finding ways to do it. Like that is the answer. Like if your city has the will to want to do right to counsel, the chances are that they can find the money to get it started. And again, it doesn't have to be all tenants. You can find a way to start with a narrower program that only covers certain tenants, like in Cleveland, where it's only families with children, for instance. That's a way to get it done if you have a more limited pot of funding. And then as you figure it out, as you go along, you can expand the scope of the ordinance to cover more tenants. But it's better to do that and get a law and a right than it is to just provide some money for legal aid without any protection in the law. Because what we're seeing with the places without a protection is that those funding sources are drying up. Without the ordinance in place, without the right, we don't see the funding continue, any funding that's initially allocated.
Thank you for that. And thank you to each one of our panelists, Lee and Aura. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be available at cityhealth.org. Be sure to follow CityHealth and NCCRC and Eviction Defense Collaborative and Lee Camp's organization, Arch City Defenders, on Twitter and all the social media platforms. Please utilize our resources and the expertise that's on our website. We work with the 75 largest cities on this policy. Reach out to us for help on this. And thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.